Although the bandits' camp was not over 12 miles down the river, we did not reach there until after midday, when we were only too pleased to stop for a little rest. We found the camp very comfortable, with ample room to accommodate all our party. After lunch it was decided that we could make better headway if we waited a day or two to allow the new snow that had fallen to settle, as we would be obliged to cross a divide of about 14,000 feet elevation the next day. The weather did not prove to be as warm as was expected, so our stay was prolonged for 4 days. The whole village treated us with the greatest respect and did everything in their power to make our stay comfortable. When we were leaving, 2 of the men asked if they could join our party. As we were expecting to recruit a number of helpers in the next large village, about 70 miles farther on, we gladly accepted them, and they were with us until we returned that fall. When we left the village, nearly 1/2 of the population accompanied us to the summit of the high divide in order to assist in breaking trail through the deep snow, and we were very thankful for their kindly efforts, as it proved a very difficult ascent. At the summit we bade farewell to our bandit friends and went on to the appointed meeting place, arriving there May 28th, 3 days after the arrival of the friends we had made the appointment with the fall before. Chapter 10. After resting for a week and reassembling our outfit, the combined expedition set out for the ancient city of the Ungers. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Where we arrived June the 30th. Here we set to work immediately, and when the first pit was down to a depth of 50 feet, we encountered the walls of an ancient building. When we had proceeded to a depth of a little more than 90 feet, we broke into a large room where there were a number of gold, silver, bronze, and clay statues, all beautifully wrought. After the work had progressed far enough to prove beyond a question of doubt that this had once been a very large city, we went on to the second location. Here we went down about 40 feet before we came upon anything that could be called definite proof of a former civilization. Again, we did enough work to prove that we were in the ruins of a large ancient city. We removed to a third location, where we expected to find evidence that would prove this the oldest and largest of the 3 cities. In order to conserve time and resources, we had organized our forces into 4 parties. 3 of these parties were made up of a leader and 6 assistants. This gave 7 men to each party. To this combined force was assigned all the excavation work and its management, each party being assigned 8 hours out of the 24. The 4th party, consisting of the remainder of the personnel of the expedition, was assigned the duties of the camp. I was in the party of which our chief was the leader. We were assigned the 8 hours from midnight until 8 in the morning. After we had completed the discovery of the first pit, and had gained access to 4 of the underground chambers or rooms, we cleared away enough of the debris to show beyond a question of doubt that this was the oldest and largest city of the 3, and that it was rich in treasure. One morning, the party which relieved our chief's party reported that there were horsemen approaching our camp from the north. When we reached the surface, we found they were headed in our direction, and it looked as though they were another bandit band, since they were evidently following the trail we had made on our way there. As we stood looking, Jas came up and said, "They are a party of bandits who are determined to loot the camp, but I do not think we need fear." We waited for them to approach, and they came on to within 500 yards of our camp, then halted. After a short interval, 2 of the men rode up and, after exchanging greetings, asked what we were doing there. They were told we were attempting to find a ruined city. To this they replied they did not believe a word of what we said. They suspected we were looking for gold, and they had come to take our equipment and supplies from us. We asked if they were government soldiers, to which they replied they did not recognize any government, as the strongest party was the one that won in that country. As they saw no evidence of firearms, I believe they came to the conclusion that there must be a larger force than was evidenced by what they could see. They returned to their band to talk over the situation. After a time, the two came back and told us that if we submitted peacefully, they would not harm any of us, but if we did not, they would advance and shoot everyone who showed resistance. We were given 10 minutes to decide, and after that time they would advance without further preliminaries. To this Jas replied that we would neither resist nor surrender. This seemed to anger them, and, wheeling their horses, they started back toward the band, waving their arms. Then the whole band came toward us at full gallop. I confess that I was badly frightened, but almost instantly we seemed to be surrounded by a number of shadowy forms on horseback galloping around us. Then these forms became more lifelike and increased in numbers. Evidently our visitors had seen what we were witnessing, for their horses were either reined in quickly or stopped of their own accord as they began to rear and plunge and get beyond control of their riders. In a moment there was a wild confusion among the band, which numbered about 75 horsemen. The horses began plunging right and left, beyond all control of the riders, and this ended in a wild retreat, with our phantom horsemen, as we called them, in close pursuit. After the excitement was over, our chief and two of the party, including myself, walked out to where the main band had halted and could find no tracks except those made by the robbers themselves. We were very much mystified at this, since the relief had looked as real to us as it did to the bandits, and the rescuers had seemed to have come from all sides. We fully expected to find the tracks of their horses in the sand, as well as the tracks of the horses the bandits were riding. When we returned, Jas said, "The phantom horsemen, as you call them, were only pictures, made so real that you, as well as the bandits, could see them. In a word, they were the pictures of other occurrences that we were able to produce in so lifelike a manner that they could not be distinguished from the real occurrence. We were able to produce them for our own protection, as well as for that of others, and no one has been harmed. Where a definite purpose is served, there is no harm in the outcome." A doubt had arisen in the minds of the bandits. It was not logical that an expedition like this would venture so far away without some protection, and we were able to take advantage of this to frighten them. They are very superstitious and always on the lookout for trickery. That type is the most susceptible to fear, and they saw just what they expected to find. If we had not used this method, we should, in all probability, have been obliged to destroy a number of the band before they would have left us in peace. As it is, we shall hear no more of them. We were not molested again. After we had accomplished sufficient work to convince us that these 3 cities existed, it was suggested that we should fill all the pits in order to protect them from any roving band that might discover the work, as such a discovery would lead to wholesale plundering for the treasure alone. There are legends among nearly all these bands that these great cities exist and that they contain hoards of gold. As we finished work, each pit was filled so as to leave as little trace as possible, and the first storm would remove any trace which we had left. The sand is continually shifting in this country, and this alone makes it very difficult to locate any of these ruins. It would have been impossible for us to discover any of the locations without the assistance of our friends. We were told that similar ruins extend well into southern Siberia. There is unmistakable evidence that a vast population had flourished here, and that they had reached a high state of civilization. There is also unlimited proof that these people understood agriculture, mining, textiles, and their allied industries, reading, writing, and all the sciences. It is very evident that the history of these people is the history of the Aryan race. While seated at the table the afternoon of our last day, one of the party asked Emil whether the history of this great race could be traced and written. He answered that it could, that the city beneath the site of our camp contained the absolute proof in written records, which, when found and translated, would give a concurrent and direct history of this people. Here the conversation was interrupted by a man appearing at the door of the tent and asking if he could come in. Emal Jast and Chandler Sen arose and hurried to the entrance to meet him. By the greetings extended, we saw that they were very well acquainted, and our chief arose and joined them. At the door of the tent we saw him stop and stare for a moment. Then he walked quickly out of the door with both hands extended, saying, "Well, well, this is indeed a surprise." A medley of voices arose as both men and women began to exchange greetings with him and the three that had stepped through the door after him. At this, all seated at the table arose and crowded outside, where we found a group of 14 newcomers. The party included Emal's mother, our hostess from the village of our former winter quarters, the beautiful lady who had presided at the banquet that we attended in Emal's home, and Emal's son and daughter. In all, they were a merry crowd, and it brought back remembrances of gatherings of former days. The surprise was complete, and we showed it, but the most complete surprise was shown by the friends who had joined us on this expedition. As we looked at them, we knew that their curiosity was getting beyond all bounds. They had not seen these appearances and disappearances as we had, and during the press of the expedition work we had been so engrossed that we had neglected to tell them of anything but fragmentary incidents. Coming, as this had, virtually from a clear sky, it left them absolutely nonplussed. Of course, we were heartily enjoying this at their expense. After introductions and greetings had been extended all around, the man who had charge of the camp and equipment sought Emal and our chief. With every evidence of abject helplessness, he said, "How am I going to feed all these people? Our supplies have not yet arrived, and we have barely enough provisions left for ourselves for this and the morning meal, since we have made every arrangement to start on our return trip." While they were conversing, they had drawn together, and the leader of the combined expedition had overheard a part of the conversation. He stepped over and joined them. As he did so, I could hear him ask, "Where in the name of heaven did all these people come from?" Our chief looked at him with a smile and said, "You have just hit it, Ray. They did come direct from heaven." "See, there are no conveyances," Ray answered, "but the thing that puzzled me most is they don't seem to have any wings." "As they do not have wings, we should have heard the thud when they landed in the sand, especially as there are so many of them. But we did not even hear that. So we are going to decide for the time that your suggestion is right and perfectly logical." Emal then turned to the company and said he would be obliged, in order to allay the fears of the steward, to admonish the visitors for not bringing along their provisions. At this the steward seemed greatly embarrassed and said he did not think of putting it quite so bluntly, but nevertheless the fact still remained that there certainly were not enough edibles to go around. Here the visitors joined in a merry laugh, which seemed to embarrass him still more. Then Emal's mother said there was no need for embarrassment or inconvenience. Our hostess and the beautiful lady joined in saying they would gladly take charge and be responsible for the supper, as they fully expected to share the meal with us. This relieved the steward, and he quickly accepted the proffered service. The afternoon was now well advanced. It was one of those days in the Gobi when the weather fairly fawns upon the earth for one moment, then in the next instant may transform the scene into an inferno of relentless fury. Every available canvas was secured and spread upon the sand, just outside the circle of the camp. To an outsider, the scene would have had the appearance of a merry picnic party, which indeed it was. When the canvas was all spread, the containers, which were used both for cooking and serving the camp meals, were brought out with their contents and placed on the canvas. Then the whole company gathered around. We could still see evidence of wonder and perplexity on the faces of those who had lately joined the party. Ray, the leader, looked at the containers and said that if he saw rightly the amount of food the containers held, and if that amount could be stretched sufficiently to feed that hungry mob, he was going to keep his eyes open for the performance of a miracle. One of our party said, "You better keep your eyes wide open, for that is just what you're going to see." Our chief said, "This is twice you have guessed right today, Ray." At this, the three ladies began serving from the containers. As each place was served, it was passed on, and an empty plate was received for the full one until all had been served most generously. As the serving progressed, we could see that Ray was getting more restless, and when his plate came to him, he passed it on, remarking that he could get along with a much less liberal helping. Our hostess assured him that he need not fear, as there would be a plentiful supply for all. After all had been served bountifully, he again looked at the containers. When he saw that the contents had not been diminished, he arose and said, "At the risk of being impolite, ill-mannered, and a bounder, I'm going to ask if I may sit by you three ladies, as I fully acknowledge my curiosity has so deliberately taken the upper hand that I cannot eat a bite." The ladies said they would look upon it as an act of courtesy if he wished to sit by them, whereupon he walked over and sat down on the edge of the canvas between Emal's mother and the beautiful lady. When he was seated, someone asked for bread. There was but one piece remaining on the box lid that served in place of a tray. The beautiful lady held out her hands, and almost instantly there was a large loaf of bread in them. This she passed to our hostess, who began cutting it, preparatory to serving. At this, the leader arose and asked if they would kindly permit him to see the loaf as it was. The loaf was passed to him, and after examining it critically for a moment, he passed it back. We could see that he was very much agitated. He walked away a few steps, then returned, and addressing himself directly to the lady, said, "I do not wish to seem impertinent, but this has muddled my thoughts to such an extent that I cannot refrain from asking questions." She bowed and said he was at liberty to ask any questions he wished. He said, "Do you mean to tell me that you are able to set aside all the known natural laws, at least those that we know of, without the least exertion, and bring forth bread from an unseen or invisible supply?" The lady replied, "To us the supply is not unseen. It is always visible." Then it was perceived that as our hostess cut and served the loaf, it did not diminish. He became more calm, again took his place, and the ladies continued, "If you could only see that the tragedy of Jesus' life ended with the crucifixion, that the joy of the Christ life began with the resurrection, and that the goal of every life should be the resurrection rather than the crucifixion. In this way all may follow him into the more abundant life of the Christ in them. Can you think of a more joyous and abundant life than to be one with this mighty power, this power of the Christ within? It is here you may know that you were created to have dominion over every form, thought, word, or condition. In living this life, which is the fulfillment of every need, you will find that you are living an exact, scientific life." Jesus increased the few loaves and fishes the little lad had until he was able to supply amply for the multitude. You will observe that he bade them to sit down in an orderly, expectant attitude, ready to receive the increased supply by fulfilling the law. If you are to find joy and satisfaction in the life of Jesus, you must fulfill the law of his life by acting in harmony with his ideals. You cannot stand and worry as to how you are to be fed. If Jesus had allowed this, the multitude never would have been satisfied. Instead, he quietly blessed and gave thanks for that which he had, and the supply was increased in sufficient measure to meet every need. Living did not become a difficult problem until man disobeyed and refused to listen to the inner voice. When he returns and again learns to listen to that inner voice, he will cease to labor for the means of a living, but he will work for the joy of creating. He will enter into the joy of creating, and he will create under the law of the Lord or Word of God. Through his Word, he will find that he can move upon the all-loving and all-enfolding substance of God and bring into visibility every ideal he holds in thought. It was in this way, step by step, that Jesus mounted to the heights and proved the supremacy of the Christ in him over the limited concept of mortal thought. When this is realized, work becomes a joyous quality of one's being. Jesus proved that the truly spiritual life is the only joyous life. He became clothed with dignity and glory because of his victory. Yet that victory left him as free as a little child. Although the world is not wholly awake to its desire, it is this desire of joy and great blessing that it is seeking. Man may seek satisfaction in the pursuit of personal things, unmindful of the law that says he shall lose that which he seeks for selfish gain. But though through the losing, he soon finds that the fall of the personal but marks the ascent of the spiritual. He realized that man's extremity is God's opportunity. You must know that you are entitled to every good and perfect gift of God, and you must prepare to receive those gifts through the knowledge of God as your divine nature. If you separate yourself from God in thought, you will also separate yourself from him in manifestation. In order to enter fully into the joy of life, you must seek life and joy for the fullness and joy that life gives to all humanity. The laws for the establishment of heaven here on earth, which Jesus taught and which you have seen applied in a very small measure, are exact and scientific. Man, being the Son and true likeness of God, contains within himself the true Spirit of God, his Father. He can discern and use the law of his creative parent and bring them into full operation in his world of affairs if he only will. Then she said they would be pleased to answer any questions he might like to ask. Ray said he did not have any questions to ask, for he had been too deeply stirred to want to ask questions. He just wanted to think. He said he had some things he wanted to say, and he hoped they would not take offense, for offense was not intended in any way. He continued, "We came here as we supposed to find the remains of a people long since dead and gone. Instead, we find a people living in a far more wonderful and active life than can be comprehended. If this thing that we have seen could be heralded abroad, you would have the whole world bowing at your feet." The three ladies said they did not wish the world to bow at their feet, but they longed to see all mankind bowing at God's feet. They went on to say that mankind already had too many idols. The ideal was the thing really needed. Here the visitors, with the exception of the one who had called at the door of the tent, arose, saying they must be on their way. With hearty handshakes and Godspeed and invitations to visit them at any time, they disappeared as suddenly as they had come, leaving Ray and his party staring at the place where they had stood. After a moment he turned to the man who had remained and asked his name. He was told that it was Baird Spalding. Then Ray said to him, "Do you mean to say that you are able to come and go at will, without any visible means of conveyance, as we have just seen, defy an ever-known law of gravity or physics?" Baird Spalding answered, "We do not defy any law, neither do we harm a single law of man or God. We cooperate with and work according to all laws, both of nature and God. The means of locomotion which we use, although invisible to you, are perfectly visible to us. The trouble is you do not see them, consequently you do not believe. We see, believe, and know, and we are able to utilize them. When you open your understanding to know and see and use them, you will soon find that the law which we use is definite and far more capable of being put to greater uses for mankind than the limited laws which you see and use. Someday you will find that you have only touched the surface of man's possibilities. We are always pleased to assist you in any way we can." Chandler Sen said that his friend had come to invite us to return to our outfitting point by way of his village, as the trail was shorter and the distance could be made with 1 day less travel at that time of the year. This invitation was readily accepted, and Baggett Iran said he would return with us. It developed later that he was a descendant of the once prosperous people that had inhabited the Gobi region. We had finished the work, chapter 11, finished the work mapped out for the combined expedition, and were prepared for an early morning start for our base, where the company would separate, and all except a part of 11 would return to their respective homes. 4 of the party, myself included, had decided to accept the invitation of our friends to return to the village of the Temple of the Tall Cross, our former winter quarters. As we stood watching the sunset on the eve of our departure, one of the party said that they had begun to wonder how old civilization and religion really were, and whether the two had really come hand in hand down the long ages of time. Jas replied, "That depends upon what you mean by religion. If by the use of the word religion you mean creed, dogma, or sect, or perhaps superstition, it is very young and does not antedate 20,000 years. But if by the word you mean a reverence for the true philosophy of life, a true reverence for life itself, thus a true reverence for the sublime purity of God, of the great creative cause, then you may trace this back beyond all history, all mythology, all allegory, to the time of man's first advent upon earth, before kings, emperors, or man-made rule held sway in the hearts of the first man. There burned or shone forth the greatest reverence for the source of all life and the beauty of that life. The beauty and the reverence of that pure soul shines undimmed through the long ages, and so it will shine on undimmed throughout all eternity. When man first took up life, he knew full well the source. He had the deepest reverence for that source, and that reverence you now know as the Christ. But as we come on down the dim corridors of time, we find them dividing into the innumerable sects, creeds, and dogmas until those corridors are divided into such a network that they present a veil of disbelief and superstition. Who, I ask, divided them? Did God or man? Who is responsible for the great vortex of sin and inharmony this division has caused? Will you pause for a moment and think deeply? Then ask yourself, is it God or man that is responsible? Then think, does God sit somewhere in the sky looking down on this great web, altering a condition here or a condition there, interfering here or smoothing out a life there, praising one or condemning another, holding up the hands of one while he tramples the other? No. If there be a true giver of life, he must be omnipotent, omnipresent, and omnipotent, far above, around, and in all, pouring out his life to all, through all, and above all. Else he is not a true giver of all life. Thus you may differentiate this ideal into the innumerable varieties of form, but when you reach the final one, you will find that you reach the one at the beginning also, and the two become a cycle with no beginning and no end. Were this not so, there could be no basis, no hypothesis, no truth. Here someone asked, "Do you attempt to overcome death?" The answer was, "Oh no, we rise up over death by letting life express to its absolute fullness. Thus we do not know even what death is. To us there is nothing but more abundant life. The great error of the majority is that they attempt to hide their religion behind some veil or secret instead of throwing it open to the broad expanse of God's pure sunlight." Someone of the party asked whether Jesus abode with them, meaning Jas people. He replied, "No, Jesus does not live with us. He is only drawn to us by the thoughts we have in common, the same as he is drawn to all by the thoughts they have in common. Jesus abides only to be of service, as all great souls do." He went on to say it was while sojourning in northern Arabia that Jesus had access to the library that had been collected from India, Persia, and the Trans-Himalayan region. Here Jesus first contacted these secret teachings of the Brotherhood. These teachings only served to drive home more firmly the conviction already forming that the true mystery of life was God expressed through the Christ in the individual. He saw that, in order to express this fully, he must withdraw from all forms of worship and worship God expressing through the individual, and God alone. He saw that, in order to demonstrate this fully, he would be obliged to withdraw from those who had taught him, even though by withdrawing he should incur their displeasure. This did not deter him for a moment, so steadfast was he in his devotion to his cause, and the great service he saw he could render to the world by that devotion. He saw that if man ever arose to the lofty power of that mighty indwelling presence, if a mighty Son of God, one in whom the divine wisdom abode in fullest measure, one rich in the outpouring richness of all of God's treasures, the fountain of the outpouring waters of life, the Lord, or law of compassion and wisdom, was actually to take flesh upon earth, he must come forth and claim these possessions. Then with pure motive he must live the life, and he would bring forth that life to which manifest presence the name of the Christ has been given. He stood forth and boldly proclaimed that the Christ that abode in him abode in all, that the celestial voice that proclaimed him the beloved Son proclaimed all sons of God, joint heirs and brothers all. This epoch is marked at his baptism, when the Spirit was seen descending from heaven like a dove upon him, and it abode with him. He also said, all are God's, manifest in the flesh. All are God's. He boldly taught that ignorance is the cause of all sin. He saw that in order to practice forgiveness, or the science of forgiving, man must be enlightened to the fact that man has the power to forgive all sin, discord, and inharmony, that it is not God who forgives sin, for God has nothing to do with the sin, sickness, and inharmony of man, that man himself brought these into being, and man is the only one who can erase or forgive them. He saw that man must learn that ignorance is disregard and lack of understanding, both of divine mind as the creative principle and of his relation to that principle. He saw that man may have an intellectual knowledge and be versed in worldly affairs, yet if he does not recognize the Christ as the living, vitalizing essence of God within him, he is grossly ignorant of the most important factor governing his life. He quickly saw the inconsistency of asking a perfectly just and loving Father to heal a disease or sin. He taught that disease is the effect of sin, and that forgiveness is an important factor in healing, that sickness is not punishment sent from God, as many believe it to be, but is the result of man's misunderstanding of his real being. He taught that it is the truth which sets free. The purity of his teachings has caused them to outlive those of his teachers. When Peter said that he forgave 7 times, Jesus' answer was that he forgave 70 times 7, then went on forgiving until the act was universal. In order to forgive hate, he centered his attention on love. That was not only when it touched his life, but when he saw it manifest in the world about him. This truth was the inherent light that he saw in all, which would lead them out of darkness when applied with understanding. He knew that every overcomer was covenanted with his Lord to be continually forgiven sin, in meeting every inharmony with truth, and this was his way of being about his Father's business. He saw and understood that in no other way could the earth be transformed and peace and harmony prevail among men. And he said, if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. In order to appreciate the full value of this statement, you may ask, what is the Father? The Father is life, love, power, and dominion, and all of those attributes belong to the child by rightful inheritance. This is what Paul meant when he said we are joint heirs with Christ to the God kingdom. This does not mean that one has more than another. This does not mean that the eldest son gets the larger portion and the other half is divided by measure to the remaining children. To be a joint heir with Christ to the kingdom means to be an equal participant in all of the blessings of the God kingdom. Sometimes others accuse us of making ourselves equal with Jesus. That is because they do not understand what is meant by joint heirship. I am quite certain there is not one among us that would say he was on the same plane of enlightenment as the great Master, with his great white purity. This joint heirship means to have the possibility of the same power, the same strength, the same degree of understanding. And yet there is not one amongst us that does not realize the full truth of the promise of Jesus to all of God's children, to every true disciple, that they may be full participants in all of the qualities of the Godhead as fully as he is. We fully recognize his meaning when he said, "Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." We know full well that that great soul never for a moment asked of his disciples a mental or moral impossibility. When he saw and asked perfection of man, he knew that he asked only that which man can live up to. A great many have taken false comfort in the belief that they can never be as perfect as the Master is perfect. They argue that he was divine and that because of his divinity he did marvelous works which no other member of humanity could possibly do, and that therefore it is absolutely useless to try. They say they are here with nothing better or more skillful or scientific than with which to carve out life's destiny than mere human willpower. The great Master made it clear that while it did take some human willpower to start, the mere human will is not a great factor in the case, the great factor being divine understanding. How many times did he say, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free"? Let us reduce this to the simple physics of the world about us. The moment men become fully acquainted with the truth of anything in the physical world about them, that moment they become free of their ignorant concept of that particular thing. The moment men become acquainted with the fact that the world was round and that it revolved around the sun, they became free from the antiquated ideal of a flat earth and the rising and setting sun. The moment men became free from the belief that they are mere human beings, subject to human laws of life and death, and the limitations which human beings have imposed, that moment they will see that they are free from all human limitation and may become sons of God if they will. The moment they realize they are divine, they are free from all limitations and possessed of the strength of divinity. And man knows that this divinity is the place where a being comes most directly in contact with God. Man is beginning to see and know that this divinity is not something to be injected into each from without. He is beginning to know that it is the very life of each and every man. We know that the ideas we have seen in the lives of others take root in our lives and, in compliance with the divine law, bring forth after their kind. As long as we believe in the power of sin and see the effect of sin as a reality, the punishment of that sin will be vital in our lives. But as we give to ourselves and others truly righteous thoughts, for all inharmonious ones, we are making ready the harvest of a great spiritual feast which is certain to follow the seed time. Thus, forgiveness has a twofold mission. It frees both the erring and the loving one. For back of the application of forgiveness is a deep and radiant love, a love founded on principle, a love that desires to give for the joy of giving with no thought of reward, save that of the Father's approval in the words, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." These words are just as true for us as they are true of Jesus. Your sins, sickness, or discord are no more a part of God or your true self than fungi are a part of the plants to which they attach themselves. They are the false increscences which have gathered upon your bodies as the result of wrong thinking. The thought of the disease and the disease are merely the cause and the effect. Erase, forgive the cause, and effect disappears. Erase the false belief, and sickness vanishes. This was the only method of cure that Jesus ever resorted to. He erased the false image in the consciousness of the one to whom he ministered. He first raised the vibrations of his body by connecting his own thoughts with those of divine mind, and holding his own thoughts steadfastly in accord with those of the perfection of the divine mind for man. Then the vibrations of his body became equal to the vibrations in divine mind. Having thus raised the vibrations of his own body by his steadfast thought of the divine perfection, he was able to raise the vibrations of the body of the applicant with the withered arm to the point where he could erase the image of the withered arm from his own consciousness. Then Jesus could say to him, "Stretch forth your hand." He stretched it forth and it became whole. Thus Jesus raised the vibrations of his own body by seeing the divine perfection for all, and this enabled him to raise the vibrations of the one he healed until the image of imperfection was entirely erased. Then perfection was instantaneous and the forgiveness was complete. You will soon find that by fixing your thoughts and attention steadfastly on God and his divine perfection, you can raise the vibration of your body so that they will blend so harmoniously with those of the divine perfection that you are absolutely one with the divine perfection and thus one with God. You are then able so to influence the vibration of the bodies of others with whom you come in contact that they see the perfection that you see. Thus you may fulfill the divine mission and your part is complete. Or you may see imperfection and thus lower the vibrations until imperfection is the result. But if you do this, you cannot escape reaping the harvest of the seed you have sown. God works through all to carry out his perfect plan, and the perfect, loving thoughts continually going forth from the hearts of all are God's own message to his children. It is these thoughts that keep the vibrations of our bodies in direct touch with the divine and perfect vibrations. And this seed is the Word of God that finds lodgment in every receptive heart, whether man be consciously aware of his divine nature or not. We are approaching more fully to our divine inheritance when we can keep our thoughts so fully upon our divine perfection and the divine perfection of all as held in the mind of God, that the vibrations of our body are in direct harmonious accord and one with the divine vibrations sent out from the mind of God. But in order to bring forth the abundant harvest of spiritual understanding, our thoughts must continually vibrate with and lay hold of the perfect harmonious thought from divine mind, or mind of God, to man, his beloved Son. We soon find we have the power to enslave or to free ourselves, as well as to forgive every sin of the whole human family, through our attitude of thought, word, or deed, and through the vibrations thus released to the whole world. Once having chosen to shape our thoughts along definite lines, we soon find that we are sustained by omnipotence itself, and find as we go through the discipline necessary to assure ourselves of mastery, that it is a glorious privilege, this power which we have to free ourselves and our fellow man from bondage through the process of divine thinking. All of Jesus' healings were on the basis of removing the mental cause, so we find that it is necessary to reduce the idealism of Jesus to practical demonstration, and by so doing we find we are only doing that which he enjoined us to do. Many sins vanish at the very first first few rays of light shed into the dark concept, while others more firmly rooted in consciousness require patience and perseverance to overcome. The forgiving love of Christ must prevail if we do not obstruct, but give it full sway. True forgiveness purifies and blesses all, and begins in the heart of the individual. This is, at first, a thought reformation, and thus a resurrection. Realizing that God is the only mind, and this mind is pure and holy, will do much to keep one holding steadfastly and worshiping the truth that the mind of Christ is having its perfect way in you, and establishes you in these harmonious, constructive thought currents. You become aware that you are always in the ever-flowing stream of the loving thoughts which God is pouring out to His children. You will soon know that you are fast approaching a period in which you will be living in a world of thinkers. You will know that thought is the most potent agency in the universe. You will soon recognize that thought is the mediator between divine mind and every bodily ailment or discord in the world. If you practice looking immediately to the divine mind, the kingdom within, when discord or inharmony arise, you are immediately united with divine ideas, and you will find that divine love is ever ready to give its healing balm of pure love to those who seek. Jesus lives today to wipe out of human consciousness the power and reality of sin and its effects. Fresh from the heart of love, He came, understanding the relation between God and man, and in His fearless, free recognition of spirit as the only power, He proclaimed the supremacy of divine law, which, when understood and applied to every act of living, will transform suffering man into radiant beings and usher in the only real kingdom of perfect citizenship, the kingdom of heaven upon earth. Here just cease talking.